That's kind of fun. Julian? Pelleggi?
Senior consultant with Mandiant, doing incident response mainly, also helping do some SOC transformations with clients. Prior to that, worked in a SOC in a large bank in Canada. I'm a Canadian, if anyone else knows. Okay. So many years experience in SOC as well.
All right, Sean.
Hey, I've been in and out of different SOCs, both as an analyst and an engineer for about 6 years, give or take, both government and private MSSP. And the last 3, I've been doing threat hunting, incident handling, and breach discovery.
Everybody loves breaches, right? And Joe Klein.
In and out of SOCs for years, both architecture, cleaning up sensors, cleaning up logs, doing analytics against the systems, and a lot of threat hunting over the years, and IR, which is always, sopping up the blood.
So now that we've introduced us, I'm curious, how many of you work in a SOC today or have recently worked in a SOC?
Get your hands up.
There we go, good bit. So that should make this fun. We want to make this interactive and help you guys out. So, kind of the first topic for discussion is some of the roles in the SOC. Joe, if you want to start us off.
No, how do you start?
Joe.
I was actually going to mention that, we have echo. I was going to actually mention that, I don't know if you know about I'm causing the echo? His mic, okay.
He's blaming me.
Okay. So, I've actually sat on a project for DHS at one point to create the NICE, which was actually to create the roles for what worked in a SOC. The only challenge is that a lot of those roles, from my perspective, were undersized as far as their capability or their education or whatever. But if you haven't seen the NICE document, you might want to go out and take a look at it. It also makes recommendations based on low, medium, and high, or senior, mid, and whatever SOC engineer.
So, just from a problem perspective, when you come into a SOC, you have engineers, you have analysts, you have guys who actually go out and remediate problems. You have a lot of that. And because a lot of this is issues in a SOC, what you find within these departments is they're all siloed.
Yeah.
So you end up with engineering over here doing engineering things that don't really take into account how it will affect the analysts, who don't really take into account what they do, how that will affect remediation team or the end client or whoever that may be. And the larger your SOC, depending on it being a small, like, single company or government to something like an MSSP, these teams can kind of develop into 15 different teams, give or take, that all exist within their own little silo. And we're going to talk about communication later, I believe, so go for it.
Okay, still on the topic of roles within the SOC, I think there's really 3 main roles, and probably everyone is going to be familiar with these, but you have your standard SOC analysts, right? These are the guys on the front lines reviewing alerts on day-to-day, churning through those things. You have your seniors, of course, so kind of more advanced level, and then you typically will find that a SOC is best equipped with a couple or maybe a few very intense technical experts, right? You don't need everyone in the SOC to be an expert in technical matters, but you have a couple of guys that you can lean on for those very complex problems. The majority of your team, really those analysts and the senior analysts, need to be guys or females as well, that you can rely on to kind of keep a consistent level of capacity for analyzing things on a regular day-to-day basis. And if you have those 3 roles in your SOC, you can add on and adjust beyond those, but I think those are the 3 core roles you really need to focus on when you're building an effective SOC.
And kind of the last part, from my perspective, a lot of the challenges have been around actually having separate roles for within the engineers to both remediate and deal with actual false positives, so tuning them out of the various tools so that you're not being swallowed by noise and a volume of tickets you're expected to close that you have no hope of because you have too many by vast majority. So that tuning aspect, as well as actually building new capabilities. So when someone says, well, do we check for this? One, having the ability to answer that question for management, which is going to come up every time they see something in the news, and also actually building those capabilities and making sure that any particular SOC has coverage for whatever today's flavor of threat is. Because pretty much everybody, I feel like, who's worked in a SOC has had that manager come down and say, the senior leadership or the board even sometimes wants to know if we have protection for X. We need a document on how we're dealing with this threat coming out, what we have right now and what we'll have next week, because that's always a fun challenge.
I think something from a long view, my view, is that the same threats come up every once in a while, almost cyclical, and you have to be prepared for it. A lot of times, at least, again, looking at long-term on stocks, organizations won't focus on one thing. It'll then open up vulnerabilities, not be prepared for it, and then you'll be playing catch-up, be it, DDoS, phishing, spam, directed attacks via Wi-Fi. I mean, these same vulnerabilities come up again and again.
Flavor of the week, so to speak.
Exactly, and flavor of the week, basically, you're always fighting, fixing that one thing, but not actually looking at the long-term architecture.
And then the systemic problem of actually building detection and remediation for those threats, which is a lot of times lost in the difficulty of actually solving the problem.
But that goes into the roles, right? So I'm very much of the train of thought here that an engineer should spend some time as an analyst.
Yes.
And an analyst should spend some time as an engineer. A little bit of cross-pollination, so to speak, so that, hey, maybe the analyst wants this rule or sees this threat or is up on his threat intel and he wants this to be made. Well, he needs to understand how the SIM works to do it or whatever piece of technology that they're using. Likewise, the engineer needs to know what the analyst wants. Otherwise, you end up in that situation where analysts are doing 3 tickets a minute.
So you're talking about engineers from the perspective of configuring and changing tuning the tools.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's very important, actually, is to really focus on being able to tune the alerts coming to the SOC. The SOC needs that cycle on a regular basis, if not daily, if not hourly. It should be instantaneous. As soon as they see false positives, they can get that tuned, and interfacing with the engineers is the only way to do that. And maybe putting engineers in the SOC.
Well, and that's really what
put
it
them
is.
in rotation for a little while.
Roles should be less specific and allow for teams to kind of intermingle a little bit to gain that experience and gain that insight.
Yeah, otherwise, from a game theory standpoint, each of them have roles that it's better for somebody else to fail for our team to succeed. And because of that, I've seen very large SOCs, especially at major organizations, that it becomes finger pointing. It doesn't become actually, hey, we're all trying to solve the problem.
That is a very common problem.
It is.
And then also working with management, because management side also has to provide those goals, because let's say your boss says you have to close X number of tickets a day. That makes it very difficult for you to actually resolve a full ticket and take it to either false positive, tuned out, true positive remediated, or network issue resolved. Anything other than those 3 is an incomplete ticket.
But let's not forget that in the security world that we live in today, most of our management team aren't necessarily security guys. So we have a responsibility to appropriately communicate with management in a way that they will understand, to kind of say, hey, this is our problem and this is what we need to do, both from a technical perspective, and this is why this benefits you. This is why this will benefit our company. And this is what it's good for. So the analysts and engineers almost have that responsibility to handle that and be able to talk to management.
I think the other thing that you have to deal with, you typically have middle management that are just project managers, not to put down project managers, but because they haven't sat in the seat to try to answer the questions, they're really looking at the numbers. They're really not looking at, hey, how can I really fix this process? Do these particular 3 people need additional training, and how do I justify training up? I mean, again, the flavor of the day, vulnerabilities, are hard to keep up if you're only sitting in front of them fighting fires. It really takes additional education and ongoing justification of funding for training. I mean, this is hard stuff. I mean, was it Dan Gear has a quote out there that this is the hardest intellectual job in the world is cybersecurity.
Does this lead us into point 2? Quite nicely, actually.
Hiring and retention. don't you start us off, Mr. Sean?
And to his point, that's a problem that we're seeing. The modern SOC has become a place for people to escape, and I mean the majority of us on this panel are people who have escaped that, right? We have gotten away from that. It has become a place to escape rather than a place where people want to be, a place where we have our best and brightest, a place where we have good analysts. And a big portion of that is because we've become so focused on this metric-based system rather than a security-based system that we don't focus on the quality of the analyst in the seat, we just focus on having someone there.
Or the quality of the work.
Absolutely.
So if you're talking about retention then, really how to retain people in a SOC, I think the goals are, one, change the metrics, right? Metrics of number of tickets is really not suitable. It has to be based on the quality, perhaps, of the work that's coming out of it. So if a ticket takes 3 weeks, but that investigation, that case actually takes 3 weeks to come to conclusion, if that's done successfully, that's what should be measured. That's the first key, I think, to really focusing on retention. The second is actually having a plan. A lot of SOC analysts feel like, all right, I'm a SOC analyst. Where do I go from here? What's the next step? And so trying to develop some stages or phases that they can go through, maybe you guys have some ideas on that, is really the second key component. But the first is get the focus on the right metrics, not on just tickets closed, because a SOC analyst coming in and just has to slog through tickets, as you see in maybe help desks, people don't want to stick around in that kind of environment, right?
Drowning tickets makes SOC analysts want to run away.
And the SOC has kind of, in a lot of places, become a glorified help desk for cybersecurity.
And also solving other things. I mean, that's one of the things I found sitting in a SOC. Any problem in the operation, any place, they define it as a security problem because they may not have the talent to actually solve that also. And those
time and energy also sometimes.
Right.
It's not just necessarily talent.
Right. And that becomes another issue because how do you actually cross-bill that and how do you have that conversation with your management that, hey, the last 30% of our tickets were solved because we were solving somebody else's networking problem or host problem or a backup problem or something else. And that becomes a real problem because then, again, that creates more burnout in the process. Because you're not actually focusing on that particular issue. You're focusing on fixing other people's problems.
So now that we've talked about retention for a few minutes on the hiring side, one of the other things is that a lot of the SOC roles that we find out there, or at least I have been targeted more towards a junior audience. And there's some incentive issues there with pay, but some of it is actually, I think in a lot of management view, the SOC is considered a junior role. And a lot of that has to do with some of the best folks trying to migrate out of the SOC to better paying, more exciting, more interesting role where they're not drowning in tickets and being unhappy. Building up that team of skilled assets and getting in experienced folks. And yes, it will cost money, but compared to the cost of the opposite, right? If you don't have a skilled team, if you can't build up your team with skilled folks, or either build a training program to build up your team or retain talent, you have to be able to get new talent in at a more advanced level. So it's really difficult.
Now, everybody does have to start somewhere. And an operations center isn't a bad place. You get all kinds of different technology, all kinds of different experience, all kinds of different problems. The problem that, and to just kind of go forward from that, is we seem to focus on it's only for these people. It's only for new people. So we don't keep experienced guys. They don't want to stay. They want to get out because it's not interesting enough. Or it's too many tickets and not enough investigation. Or, hey, maybe I want to do malware and I want to learn how to do that. And we see malware, but that's not in my job description. And there's a lot of that. Oh, you're this tier. You can't touch this. Rather than letting a person kind of base themselves on their own ability and their own desire to go forward and be a better asset to that team.
So what do you see as the average retention time for somebody coming into this role at this point?
6 months to a year and a half tops.
Yeah. Typically people burn out very quickly. So if the cost of rehire is the cost of 2 months' salary, that's significant if you're burning your people out. One of the things that I've been part of is to do things like have a mentor. The other thing is implementing purple teams and making sure that the red team is actually helping them understand some of the technical issues. I've done that before. I've been the purple team person as my red team was coming in. To have the conversation of, hey, are you seeing this on your sensor? How do you actually see this kind of thing? What are the details you're looking for? Hey, it looks like you're filtering this out. Why have you filtered that out? That's kind of interesting.
I think another part of that's going to be a management thing.
Yes.
Because I've done interviews, and I've gone in for SOC jobs and done these interviews, and the first thing that they tell you is, I want you to understand that this is a revolving door job. We don't expect you to stay here. This is a foot in the door, and then you'll move on to something better as soon as it comes up. And that's our expectation.
If I ever heard that, I think I would have probably not accepted a role with that company, but I mean,
it happens. And
getting that first role is complicated.
I appreciate that honesty from these guys.
Yeah.
But it's a failing of the SOC itself to treat it that way and to build it that way.
I would agree. I mean, I definitely agree with your points in terms of it's a failure to build it that way, but I think, you know, like you said, right, they're being honest with the people that are coming in because the SOC, the way it is set up like that. What we're trying to say here is maybe it shouldn't be built that way. And so when you're hiring, if you want to hire the right type of people in your SOC, in my opinion, I think the three kind of key components of somebody that you want to hire into a SOC doesn't necessarily mean they have to be fresh out of school, but you need people who can self-learn, right, so they can teach themselves new things, new concepts very easily, who are very curious, who will never leave a question unanswered, right? I think that's very important for someone in a SOC to have that kind of drive to figure out what is this, why is this. And if they don't know something, to go and figure it out and learn it, because you're always dealing with something new. And then the third thing is really that persistence, right? They won't give up. So that's in line with the curiosity. They're going to persist and focus on trying to solve that problem no matter what. If you have those three qualities, you actually don't even need that much technical expertise. I've actually had people come into a SOC with a chemical engineering degree or a psychology degree, and just because they had those capacities, we were able to teach them all the technical, and they were able to then take that and become very successful. So hiring in the SOC, start off with getting the right people, and then you got to figure out how to keep them there.
And that's the key, right? So if you bring in those kind of people, because I agree entirely about the type of person that you need for this work. So if you want to keep them, you have to bring them into an environment that nurtures those things that you expect when they come in the door. You have to let them be curious. You have to let them dig down the metaphorical rabbit hole. Mm-hmm. They have to have enough time to do that. They have to have enough time to fuel that passion and look and learn and see.
But then again, we have the balance of what management expects, and that's where the burnout comes in. That's where, you know, there's actually a level of depression. I saw a presentation at DEF CON last year that within 3 to 6 months, SOC engineers get very depressed because it's just such a hard job, but they just don't know how to actually deal with this much data, and their lives are basically, you know, just the SOC.
The drowning in tickets, I think, is most of that.
So in IR, a lot of IR and a lot of the stuff that we do is kind of on an up and down scale. So it's almost you're part research. You're part of a research division on top of that. Yeah. So from a fixing this problem perspective, maybe when you bring these guys in, you need to allocate, you know, so many hours a month for research that is just set aside for these guys to do personal development research and investigations that fit their own fancy.
The other thing is training. Again, this is pretty hard, whether it's video or on-site or going to cons like this. Show up at this con next year. A lot of times management can't justify training their junior guys to understand this. Honestly, I learned more from walking around and having conversations, not just presentations here, but having conversations out in the hall on some of the challenges that I have, than anything, but management doesn't deal with that. So the issue is that middle management and upper management have to start coming up with a system to say, yeah, you know, to keep you from burning out, let's make sure you have time to do research, make sure you have time to ask questions of other peers in the community. And, oh, by the way, not just product-specific, but product non-specific conferences. Because asking the questions, the non-specific conferences ask questions that the product-specific conferences won't even discuss. Mostly because sometimes there are limitations in their products. And you have to ask those questions beyond that technology, beyond that scope.
And that probably ties into the retention thing too, right? Yes. I mean, if you are rewarding your guys with good training, they get to go to cool conferences, and they get some time to do a bit of research or maybe play around in the lab when tickets are at a lower volume, I think that definitely would help people to feel a bit more like, this is a cool job, I want to stay here, rather than I'm just going to come in 6 months to a year and then get out.
Now, all that means cost, right? It's an additional cost, but from a SOC perspective, one of the things that I've noticed as a trend is clients and potential clients are more and more unhappy with the SOC system as it is.
Right.
So really, if you think about it from a long-term spectrum, they're going to lose more money long-term from unhappy clients no longer paying or no longer keeping than they are from paying a little bit more to make sure that their guys are happy and knowledgeable.
And again, the problem of retainment, if you lose people and having to retrain them, setting aside budgeting for that time to move forward. Again, if you're not moving forward within your role, you're probably going to be looking forward to moving outside of your role at some point.
Typically it takes anywhere from 3 months to 6 months to get somebody up to speed, not just in the technology and the process, but how to actually work within the environment.
So next we have budgeting, because everybody loves and hates to talk about budgeting. So one of the big challenges is tech versus people. Where do you spend your money? A lot of managers have decided that, or heard marketing to say that such and such product can replace X number of engineers. I think I've never found that to actually be successful in any context, but there's certainly a large volume of tools. There's a large volume of people, and finding a happy medium is a difficult thing. So with open source tools, you sacrifice time of your actual people to build up better tools, to build up your open source projects and get them running in your environment. So whether you're paying for a pre-made tool or whether you're paying for an open source tool to be actually set up, configured in your environment, either way, you're still ending up spending some money. I personally think people is kind of the way to go about that.
I'm with that. I mean, let's do a scenario, because we have a crowd. So we have a bunch of people who work in SOCs or have recently worked in SOCs. So let me give you a scenario. You go into work and you sit down and you're there for 8 to 10 hours a day, right? So within that time, you have a SIM system or some system that gives you tickets. An alert gets generated, a ticket gets created, and you handle that. There's not really a lot of investigation. There's not really a lot past this generated alert. This is all you get, be it an email or within your SIM. And then you figure out, oh, this is nothing because I've seen it 100 times. And you just close it and move on. Or, oh, well, let's just send this up to the client and forget about it. How many people's lives is that right now? I must be way off base if nobody's raising their hand right now, because I've seen that in a lot of places.
They just don't want to admit to it.
It sounds like I got one. I got one anyway. Maybe they just don't want to admit to it, or maybe I'm way off base. I could be.
I'm going to mention this because we were talking about it earlier. One of the PhD candidates at Mandiant did a really good study of process that we go through, the successful and the not so successful closing the ticket. And the first thing most people look for is the IP address without context. So if you see it's some nation state, you go, oh gosh, that's bad. We've seen that from before. But what if it's not that nation state and it was a spoofed address? There's a lot of context that doesn't come back to the individual from these tech tools, because you don't know that this particular address was just spoofed 1 minute ago, or this particular attack is actually coming. It's actually an IPv4 attack, but they're also attacking through v6. So you get the ticket, and somebody else gets the IPv6 ticket, and somebody else gets a tunnel ticket. It's actually the same attacker, and that's hard to deal with technology today.
Well, look at the number of tools that we have now that exist today that are proprietary information. So alert fires, it's X. I want to know why X fired. Oh, it won't tell me. I got a 3-line description, but I've got no technical information on what X is. I have no way of verifying whether or not that's bad.
I have no way of going forward and doing anything with that ticket.
Exactly. I can choose to either trust it and send it up or not trust it.
So I think a key here is that technology is a tool. It's good, but you really need to invest heavily in your people too. And I think a lot of times organizations end up focusing too much on buying tech, right? Management buys this technology. They hear the latest buzzwords. Now I need a dynamic sandbox. Now I need a next-gen firewall. But really you need to focus, I think, primarily on getting the right people, pay them properly so that they're not leaving constantly, or so that you can attract the right talent. Focus more of the money on that at first so you can build up your team, and then the tools and technology will be used by experienced folks or people who can figure it out most effectively.
Really?
I didn't do it.
Technology is legitimately there as a function for people to use, as a thing for people to use. That's what this tech is for. It still needs a person. A person is important in this in this equation, and we seem to often forget about the importance of the person.
I think we're also seeing people apply machine learning and not actually having
I love buzzwords.
fully buzzword compliant. Our SOC is there. The challenge is that when you start looking at some of these algorithms, some of these statistic processes, the attackers are now attacking the ML. So how do you mitigate that without a person actually asking the question to say, wait a second, this doesn't make sense?
I think also another side of this is when you deploy a tool, giving proper time and resources to actually utilize it and make full use of it. So when I say that, I've found organizations that were trying to deploy rapidly tool after tool after tool, typically right after a breach. They'll deploy 8, 10 tools without the time to actually make use of any of them. So they have an incredible volume of information coming in and no processes, no automation on dealing with that data. And you can not deal with that many new tools in your environment and actually get meaningful data. Absorbing them one at a time and taking, okay, now we've added, Web Inspect or something like that. Okay, let's get it time to tune it down so we're actually getting meaningful information from it and adjusting it to our environment. If your tool doesn't need to be adjusted to your environment, there's something wrong with the tool. Every environment is dramatically different. They all have all kinds of different information. I've never seen a tool that you can throw in your environment and not have to do a fair amount of adjustments to make it give valuable information to your environment.
And you have to be sensitive to it because of a couple of things. Number one, people that are not aware of the protocols, the environment, whatever, may tune down a product so that you miss some of the more important vulnerabilities. You know, I'm sorry if I run only a Microsoft set of signatures and I only have Microsoft. I don't really need Linux detection in that space, except I have a Linux machine on and that shouldn't be on my network. Those are the kind of things. The other thing is a lot of these tools have variability. I patch this tool. How do I know it's actually triggering off of that signature? How do I know that it's actually successfully triggering off that signature, or the next patch actually fixes that and then wipes out a dozen other signatures? So the repeatability is something that you have to have a person to ask those questions.
If you don't have a test after you update, how do you know it's still working? That happens in AV, but how many other tools do you have known tests for that are guaranteed to produce a result?
We had a switch patch that wiped all the VLANs, so all the sensors went off. And we went back and we found that the administrator never had a process to validate those sensors were actually on the right VLANs. So they were actually pointed at servers that weren't external and were low risk. So it's those kind of things that you have to go through and you have to deal with and you have to pick up quickly for a person. Again, the technology is not picking this up.
Another fun one with this was a company bought a product. 6 months later, they got owned. Vendor goes to the customer and says, oh my God, you just bought our product. Can we do something to help? Do you need some additional training, tuning, adjustment? Come to find out that customer hadn't unboxed the product yet. It was still in a closet. So if you don't have the time, people, energy to deploy, resources to deploy these tools and actually manage, maintain, and actually tune them to your environment, again, we're much more towards the people side of things, because until you've actually implemented it, the value that tool is providing is very minimal.
Are we on to the next one?
Yes, sir.
He beeped. Did.
Inter-team communication. So, Sean.
This is my big one.
Yep.
Just from everywhere that I've been, it's always been a siloed environment. It's always been Team A, Team B, Team C. Engineering, analysts, and remediation, or any number of people that you can throw in to do varied tasks depending on how big the organization is. And it's this siloed sense of no communication. And we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about roles. Right. But you almost have to break these roles down and include communication. And one of the things that I'm a big proponent of from a perspective of building out a SOC and kind of making a SOC better is to take not a manager, but a senior analyst or a senior from each team and put them on basically an advisory committee that once a week or once a month meets with every other team and says, hey, engineering, us analysts are dying here for X reason. We need this from you. What can we do for you? And get the technical people talking about what they need from one another to solve problems across teams.
And what they need from management.
Yes.
Reviewing processes for a lot of different federal teams, I noticed that that's typically not included.
So here, I'm going to throw out an idea here.
Please.
If you want to improve inter-team communication, right, I'm going to stereotype a little bit, but set up events or activities between the teams that maybe help them bond outside of work-related stuff. If you're in an organization that allows alcohol, maybe go to the bar. Everyone can have a beer together and just chill, relax. Maybe you want to set up a CTF or have a LAN party night or something, if everyone likes playing computer games. StarCraft Brood Wars just became free, right? I'm sure everyone's heard of that in the 90s or early 2000s. Set up a night or set up a day, because when people empathize with each other, when they can sympathize with someone else as a human, it makes it a lot easier for them to understand those people's problems that maybe they don't have the same views on, right? So if the engineer says, the tool's on and it's working, just leave me alone, don't bother me. And the analyst is like, no, but you don't get it, it's not really working properly. If they have a relationship beyond just engineer and analyst, they're going to work more effectively together.
Yeah, I just read a book on this to understand some of the problems we have in security. It's called Bowling Alone. And it's basically isolating ourselves to the point that we're in our own heads or only with our groups, that we don't actually reach out and ask other questions. We don't learn things. We become so self-focused we don't miss it. We miss real communications.
Yeah. And that's why I like, instead of just submitting a ticket to their side, just putting them in a room. Because people face-to-face tend to get along way better than people over an email or whatever the case may be. There's empathy when you have to look somebody in the eye and say, screw you, or I don't want to listen to that. Like, you just don't do that to people face-to-face.
Or resolved won't fix.
Resolved won't fix. Or I'm just going to drop your priority even though I know it's an issue. Whatever the case may be. But I think humanizing these inter-team humanizing is a big step to making these inter-team communications work.
Right.
Because engineering and analysts should not be enemies. They should not hate each other. They should not be mad at each other or trying to pass the buck. They're one unit.
Let me extend that. Also, your network people and your host people, your server people, they should also be included in some of these, your development people. It simplifies the whole process. I know one company that I work with setting up a SOC, we started bringing the team in once a month and have pizza and just have conversation about some of the challenges we have. And those kind of challenges that actually broke down some walls to the point that the analysts could call a specific admin and go, hey, I know that you work on this. Can you tell me about this? We just found this. And it basically short-circuited the going up the chain, going down the chain, which saved hours or days in some cases. By the way, the inter-team communications, you also have to have the shifts. Because there's different shifts, there's weekend shifts, there's people that are stuck on holidays, and they too are usually excluded from these kind of processes.
Absolutely. If you're not on day shift in most situations, you're excluded from really having any input, for the most case.
Right, because you're a night shifter.
Yeah, you get stuck in this little silo. I did night shift for many years. You get stuck in this little silo where you don't know what the company is doing, you don't know what's new, you just walk into new stuff and you go, hey, what's this? Guy on second shift? I don't know, it was there when I got here.
Yeah, exactly.
if every other team views you as creating problems for them, it's not going to be a fun organization. Building that relationship and breaking down those barriers is crucial to being able to be successful as a SOC. Now we beat that down.
Yeah, are we on the next one?
Yep.
Next.
Oh, this one's fun.
Lovely evil beast of compliance versus security. So, having worked in or stood up a security operations center that was supposed to be for security and ended up kind of getting driven by the compliance team. Sadly, it was the compliance team who paid the bills, so they kind of won out in a lot of ways. The technical difficulties of implementing good security is much, much more complicated and much, much more expensive than compliance. Compliance is more just documenting good security practices and actually proving that they work and they're repeatable and they're tested. So while that is painful and frustrating to sit there and document what you do, it also becomes insanely valuable when moving with other teams, new people in the team, new management. When you have a book of processes and actually have a plan, it's really helpful.
Now, bear in mind, almost everything that we've talked about thus far, right, is really heavily focused on the security side. Right. They're always going to have compliance shops, and not compliant shops are always going to be compliant shops. So from that perspective, most of our plans, so to speak, or what we would like to see happen to kind of fix the overall problems of SOCs probably won't take the same effect in a compliant shop. But they'll always exist, and they have to exist. Just everything that we talk about is mostly for the security-centric side, because we're security-centric people.
I think that's the key, is that when setting up a SOC, you need to decide what the focus is going to be. Is it focused on security and protecting the organization from threats and attacks? Or is it going to be focused on compliance-type activities? Usually, the intention is the former, and sometimes you end up with the latter, unfortunately. But that has to be a trade-off, right? If you end up having your SOC analysts essentially becoming compliance checkers, just to make sure that, oh, is there a ticket in for that change? Was that approved? Yep. Oh, this server got updated. Was that approved? Yep. You take away time from them to actually be doing investigations that you might think are more valuable.
And we go back to hiring and retention.
Right. I want to bring up one other thing. We've seen cyber insurance a lot. To reduce focus away from security towards compliance so that they can get funded to fix these issues. So if I get caught, yeah, I know, it makes me very angry. I've literally seen organizations dumb it down to the compliance only, fill out the forms, and then, hey, we had an attack, please, I want the $20 million you promised me. This doesn't work very well, by the way, for government. But from the commercial standpoint, that's becoming the thing, is to just have the compliance so you have the check boxes for the insurance company, and then you're good.
Yeah, it's turning into there's no more fixing breaches, there's no more worrying about even what you have from a security perspective past what you need to have the insurance. Right. And, I mean, in a sense, can you really blame? Because the system that we're at right now, it's really not a matter of if a company is going to get breached, it's a matter of when. So from that perspective, or how often. So from that perspective, I kind of feel like this stuff is coming up because we're failing. We're not doing enough to provide good security to make it valuable for companies to utilize it, rather than just saying, I'll just pay for the breach.
I don't know. I think my data, I'd rather work with a company that actually wants to protect my information rather than pay me out when they lose my fingerprints or social security number or whatever. But
I definitely agree, but you see situations where, like you said, the company, it actually might be cheaper for them to pay a $20K ransom than to actually hire in a security team for a full year to protect them against that ransomware attack, right? So I think that... True, yeah. It depends on how valuable the data is or how big the impact is on your organization.
Do they ransom the backup? Do they infect the backup and lock it up?
We've seen whole companies go out of business within 2 to 4 weeks because of compromises, and by the time the insurance is paid, they're out of business. So recognize that's been occurring for probably 10 years. By the way, has anybody read the RAND report called Security and Privacy? It's 50 years old, that deals with all the same problems we keep on seeing again and again. The products aren't fixing it. It's people that are trying to fix it. There's from a game theory standpoint, people are pushing back, which is really what this conversation is about, is financially justifying it. But if you can find it out on the net, you'll find it really interesting. We haven't fixed problems over 50 years. I'm not that old. I wasn't young when that was, out there, but it is very frustrating.
All right, I think we've killed that. So from here,
Moral of the story is make sure your teams are focused on security and less on compliance. Compliance is useful, of course, but you really want to make sure the breaches are prevented or at least detected very quickly and responded to as quickly as possible.
The change in this situation, because changing the structure of a SOC is not going to come from management who has nothing to do with cybersecurity. Changing the structure of the SOC and of our operations center and of our culture, so to speak, that we have right now is going to come from analysts and people who are there pushing back against what they've been given and insisting that it be better.
in a constructive way.
Yes.
They're constructive or they leave, and that's the other part of retention, is the frustration of people that are really motivated. Several friends have actually models around this that eventually get to a point you're frustrated, you leave, so you lose your most talented people, and you make no changes to the system. You actually have a decrease in the ability to solve specific problems because you've lost that talent, and then you have to build that talent back up again. You eventually get somebody else that really wants to turn this into security and not compliance.
Or can't use those tools anymore because all your experts left.
Or the licenses didn't get paid for.
Yeah. If we as a community, though, can come together on this and insist that if we're going to get paid to do this, which we get paid to do this, but we should insist that we're going to do it the right way. And if we can do that, and we can make that case by leaving the places that don't, which we absolutely have the ability to do, all that will be left in the end is good places. And I think we're up here on a panel talking about it, but it's literally going to take the entire community to make the change.
Your turn. You got to say something.
He started.
Okay, I just figured I'd try.
All right, so do you all have any questions related to SOC that you want us to discuss?
I'm going to walk down that way, and if people want to come up, because that way the recording will get them.
I was just going to repeat them, but yeah.
You can do that too.
Works. Up to you. Go ahead. So what uptick in techniques or tools is popular now, basically?
That's like a 2-year cycle. You go IDS to SIM to host-based monitoring is the complete hotness right now. And
I don't know. I've seen a lot of ML coming up and just popping up all over the place.
ML's the new one.
Is the question on defense tools or attack techniques? Attack techniques? Okay.
We're going the opposite direction. Whoops.
I think
we did. Yeah.
I think okay. Lately, let's say, what are you seeing? HTAs and JavaScript files and email attachments is probably number one, right? Attackers have switched to that. Word document macros, Excel macros, probably number two.
Yeah, but that actually has been around for a while. It's funny because at one point that Microsoft company actually disabled macros, and they re-enabled it in a lot of their products, and then we started getting compromises again. And what was it, 8 months ago, I noticed that SANS is teaching very heavily how to use this. So there's actually a life cycle on how this takes place as far as a defense and an attack posture. We start seeing somebody forget something in a product, whatever that is, whether it's Apache, we see a standard change like we saw in DTCP. Which was an IETF standard, which caused other protocol failures that rolled into lots of headaches. So yeah, we see these vulnerabilities coming from lots of different places.
I will add, in the 9 years or so that I've done this, the methodology has not changed that much. The specific vulnerability that the methodology hits changes all the time. But the actual methodologies from an attack perspective and how attackers are trying to come in, it doesn't change that often.
And frankly, the tools don't change that much from a defensive perspective. I mean, we're using the exact same tools we used 5-7 years ago, and there really hasn't been much change except for signatures and tuning. And what's the new threat of the week? A lot of it just keeps coming around and around like a merry-go-round.
Host-based stuff is newish, though. Like full-on host analysis is a little
EDR
newer.
tools?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little newer and a bit of a newer kind of technology, that almost super advanced investigative AV, so to speak.
I think that came out of a lot of disappointment that it took so long for the AV community to respond to vulnerabilities. I was part of a group that did a study, and we found that most of them took anywhere from 20 to 30 days to actually take a vulnerability and turn it into a signature. And because of that, it required rewrites for a lot of the products. Unfortunately, that left people vulnerable if they were directly attacked for 20 to 30 days.
And that's assuming that the malware author didn't rewrite it in that time because they saw it in some online medium.
It's
where
interesting,
it's been
and that's the thing. It's interesting now that we have that online medium, right?
Right.
You can grab a hash and pop it in and check 50 AVs like that for free.
Absolutely, and that's actually a process. I've seen 3 presentations over the last 5 years at different conferences. I attend a lot of conferences that specifically said, if you are a malware developer, this is what you should be doing.
I think I'm going to take a bit of a different spin on it, actually. Maybe slightly disagree with you guys. I think the technologies are important. Maybe the attack tools might be changing a little bit, but really when it comes down to it, now I'd say attackers are focusing mostly on the people, which is what they started off doing, right? In the early 90s or whenever, it was easier to phone someone and get them to just read you the password over the phone than to try and create some super secret malware that's going to hack in and do something crazy. And I would like to say that that's what we're seeing a lot more of now.
We are. Yeah.
Less on super technical stuff and more on just focusing on.
I don't know that
people.
it's been like that for a long time, I think. But good example. Dridex just did V3, right? So Dridex V3 is an Adobe Acrobat file that opens up a Word file that does PowerShell and then infection vector. What's interesting about it is when you open it up, it starts with Adobe. You have to enable macros. So first you get an email. You have to download the attachment from the suspicious email. You have to enable macros in Adobe. You have to enable macros in Word. You have to turn off protected view in Word when it pops open. So there's 5 manual steps to infection there. And large companies are getting hit with this, hundreds of people.
But it was the perfect candidate. It was the best resume ever.
We're also receiving a lot of, or we were up until 3 months ago, we were receiving a lot of calls from Microsoft support. By the way, if you're interested, I have
those calls.
Dozens of those. Yeah, I usually have a virtualization. I pop up and I pull down the malware. Oh, I've kept them on for an hour, finding out where they are and all the other information to reverse social engineer them. But, you know, we see those all the time, and it just takes one person in an organization to do that, or plug in a USB stick, or, you know, whatever. Click on that link because somebody said, hey, we provide this really cool product for your sales guys. You need to check us out. Go to this website.
If you're looking for ones of those to troll, though, the Google support numbers that you can find when you Google Gmail support is hilarious. Gmail support, Googling that will actually get you a bunch of scams. A friend discovered that by accident.
Should we do more questions?
Did
we sufficiently answer your question? Sweet. Should we do more?
Over, so.
Well, we were like 15 minutes late.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Maybe one more, if somebody has one more?
1 or 2 more, yeah. What about threat intelligence? Threat intelligence. So, I'm one that I have a very strong view on this. Today, a lot of SOCs, pretty much everyone that I've found or talked to has had a struggle where they're struggling with alerts that are 99% when they get an alert, they know something bad just happened. They're not dealing with all of those. They're not preventing those. So purchasing a list of IP addresses and user agents and other resources that a lot of these threat intel companies are putting out a lot of these organizations just aren't ready for, right? When you get to the point where you've resolved the primary, 99% type threats, then you can start to move on towards the threats that are a little bit lower percentage accuracy. So when you've got that process down, when you've gotten that matured, okay, maybe it's time to move on when you've blocked your dried X's and things that you see regularly and repeatedly in the same organization.
I think also threat intel, it's useful, but maybe not as an independent trigger. Maybe you use that to help build a story, right? You have an IDS alert, and maybe there's some threat intel reputation information about that IP address that plays it apart. The biggest challenge I think that people have with threat intelligence based on IP and domain, stuff like that, is it ages and dates very quickly, right? If it's a week old, maybe it's useful. If it's a month old, I don't even know if I would care. If it's a year old, it's basically garbage at that point.
So the question is an organization, and is your organization at that point capable of taking something in and then making a choice on a weekly basis? Hey, do we need to get rid of this now? Is this still relevant? Because I don't know a lot of organizations that are mature enough to do that on a weekly basis with threat intelligence.
And weekly is really not the issue. There are several feeds to look for bad DNSs that the DNS is only good for anywhere up to 5 to 30 minutes. So how do you actually add those and remove those from your system quick enough, but still retain them so that if you do get compromised by malware or whatever, you can say, okay, we saw this 1 month ago. From my perspective, I think that a single IP address and a reputation system has pretty much failed, mostly because we're focusing on an IP address, and that's an ephemeral number. And you're not actually associating an attacker towards it. You're associating this ephemeral number. One of the experiments I tried was, what if I take one of those ephemeral numbers and fake an attack? Does it show up? Yeah. I then spent about 6 months telling people to take my IP address off of this particular list. And by the way, this was behind a carrier NAT, because there's now 2 levels of NAT out there. And therefore, anybody that was actually blocked from that, their VPNs and their applications would stop working for 10 to 15 minutes, and then they would start working again. Kind of kills help desk calls. Okay, so I tried this experiment, and I realized, well, we need to really know the attacker. We need to get additional signals from the attacker, something like, I call it device super identities. That way you can actually say, it's this identity of this device and this user or attacker associated with it, and all the IP addresses associated with that particular thing. Because we can change addresses quickly.
Basically, to an earlier point, right? It's something that can be valuable should you have the people in place to use it appropriately.
But I think going to your point about attacker profiles, I think that is probably actually threat intel that people can use, or the SOC team can use, if they're not getting IP and domain reputation. Because IP and domain reputation, much more difficult to handle. But attacker profiles, that's actually kind of useful.
Yeah.
The profile about an attacker group, a threat group. Those types of threat intel, which is different than just atomic threat intel, can help the teams to understand what kinds of threats are facing their industry. Okay, let's read the profile of the top 5 attackers who attack retail, because I work in a retail SOC. And now I know the techniques that those attacker groups are using more often. That, I think, is valuable intel that any SOC can use.
And also it provides you all the recon techniques. It provides all the pre-techniques. Who do they actually target? Oh, new employees that have their names associated with a website. Things like that. Those are, again, attack the people first. It's the technology second.
All right. Do we have a final question?
Did we answer your question?
Yes. How has it changed in the past few years, and where's it going in the next few years?
I feel like with the onset of technology, at least in the past few years, what we've seen is as we've gotten more technology, we've gotten more focused on that technology, and we've gotten more focused on this ticket-based system that we run in, where it used to be a bunch of guys looking at PCAPs and looking at raw logs, and it took a real analyst. I mean, it was really crappy work, but it took a real analyst. where now we have technology to tell us what the problem is, so it doesn't really take an analyst anymore. We have the technology. As far as where it's going, I'm really hoping that some of the stuff that we're talking about here, we can start to bring analysts back and make the SOC a good place for, not just a place to escape.
I think there's also a growing trend towards orchestration, right? Automating a lot of those level 1 tasks. Some of it I think you definitely can automate, right? Having somebody receive an alert and then pull 5 other log sources and simply aggregate them and do some deduping, that totally can be automated. And I think in the next few years you're going to see people pushing orchestration tools, that's the term for it, security orchestrators, because they want to automate it so they don't have to worry about the turnover at the level 1. They don't have to worry about as many level 1 analysts if they can automate 90% of that. But
it's going to be so misused.
We're not sure yet whether that's going to play out or whether they might end up having to go back to full human SOCs. We'll see how technology progresses, I think.
I agree.
Solid.
I think automation is going to play a key role, and I think in the last couple of years even, the maturity of some of the SOC tools, some of the SIEM solutions going in a very different direction, more towards the almost research perspective with Elasticsearch and Splunk and those kinds of tools blowing up and becoming much more the standard versus traditional alert-based tools like a lot of the other old school SIEM solutions. I think given you get a lot more ability to really dig in and research and pivot until you are bored and tired of it.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen as trends on some of the security startups in the world is the ability to outsource that analysis at different levels and to people who have specific expertise in a protocol. There's 2 companies right now, and there's a third one I just heard about. I'm not sure how successful it's going to be because you're actually opening up your SIM or your analytics to somebody else, and how fast that can actually happen. But I've seen that as a trend. I've seen the other trend is leveraging things like software-defined networks, Docker, things like that, to move the problem around. Maybe it becomes more of a DevOps feature. But, there's a lot of other technologies that are being pushed into the market that we don't know how successful. We have no way of measuring it at this point. And if we had the ability to measure it, this would actually be a lot easier of a job. I mean, how many real vulnerabilities did you receive? How many false, how do you actually identify, false flags, false information, how do you classify them right now? A lot of people, it used to be if somebody pinged your firewall, you said, oh my God, I was pinged. It must have been an attack. But
how many times a second do you get port scanned today?
Yeah. Well, I don't have that on my IPv6 networks. I just want to mention that.
I disbelieve.
Oh, you have seen my lots?
We'll talk. All right.
So we did want to mention, because we talked about this a little bit beforehand, because it looks like there's still a few questions, that after we wrap up, which I think we're going to do in a second, we're going to make ourselves available kind of on the couch area over there for anybody who has any additional questions or just wants to have a conversation.
Yeah. The other thing is we were discussing opening up a Google Doc for other people to put questions in and suggestions and things like that. I think this is a chance because I've never seen a group specifically to deal with SOC in the last 5 years to say, hey, there's a problem here, let's figure out how to solve it. So if you're interested in that, provide a contact.
We'll send you an HTA file, just make sure that
as long as it's in a PDF, I'm good.
Yeah, it will require Flash. Yeah, there you go.
Nah, it'll be fine. All right. So we have about an hour and 45 minutes before the party, and we have some lovely giveaways. That's always a good thing. And we also have some lost and found. Apparently some cell phones and a credit card. I'm still have a few questions on how that happened, but yeah, as I said, right outside we'll have more discussions.
Thanks everyone for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Get them up here. So you shouldn't run away. Yeah, don't run